The German advance had been unstoppable for 3 days, until a single rifleman they never saw turned a quiet forest road into a 6-hour graveyard. At 6:47 a.m., the first man died without a sound. Sergeant Klaus Brenner was riding in the lead vehicle, chest high above the armored hull, binoculars pressed to his eyes. He was scanning the tree line the way he'd done 100 times before, casually, confidently, certain that the Americans were gone. The bullet entered just above his right eyebrow and left through the back of his skull. He slumped forward, his body draped over the turret edge like a discarded coat. The column behind him kept moving. 30 seconds passed before anyone noticed something was wrong. They assumed he ducked inside to check a map. They assumed a piece of shrapnel had startled him. They assumed everything except the truth. The truth was invisible. Somewhere in those dark pines, swaying 90 feet above the frozen ground, a young American rifleman had just fired the first round of a nightmare. Private First Class Leo Vance pressed his cheek against the wooden stock of his Springfield M1903. His finger rested on the trigger guard. He didn't breathe. He didn't blink. He just waited. The Germans below him began shouting. Officers pointed at the tree line. Soldiers dismounted from half-tracks and crouched behind wheels and armored doors. Their eyes swept the ground, the ditches, the farmhouse ruins, the hedgerows. They never looked up. Why would they? No doctrine in any military manual had ever warned men to check the treetops for an enemy sniper. That wasn't how warfare worked. That wasn't how anyone fought. But Leo Vance had stopped caring about doctrine 2 weeks earlier, when his own platoon had laughed in his face. The winter offensive had smashed through the Ardennes like an iron fist through glass. American units were scattered. Radio lines were dead. Everyone was retreating, falling back mile by mile, trying to find ground that could be defended before the Panzer divisions turned the retreat into a slaughter. He didn't climb that tree to die. He climbed it to make them remember his name. Vance had studied the terrain maps alone by flashlight while other men cleaned their rifles and wrote letters home. He'd noticed something the officers had missed in their panic. The road through this forest wasn't just convenient, it was the only route. On either side, the ground was too soft for tanks. Too thick with ancient pines. If the Germans wanted to push through this sector, they had to use that road. And that road passed directly beneath a ridge of Norway spruces that rose from the forest floor like cathedral spires. "I can see everything from up there," Vance had told his platoon sergeant. "Every vehicle. Every officer. I can stop them for hours." The sergeant had laughed until his face turned red. "You want to climb a tree in the middle of an artillery battle? 80 feet up with no cover and no way down? That's not a fighting position, son. That's a coffin with branches." The other men had joined in. They called him the treetop trooper. They asked if he was planning to build a nest. They joked that he must be afraid of the ground, that maybe he'd rather fight in the sky where German bullets couldn't find him. What would you have done? Stood there and argued? Tried to explain the geometry of angles of fire to men who'd already decided you were crazy? Vance had done neither. He just nodded, walked away into the darkness, and disappeared. That night, while the rest of the platoon dug frozen foxholes, he moved through the forest alone. His rifle. A bandolier of ammunition. 50 feet of rope he'd stolen from a supply depot. 1 canteen of water. No rations. No backup. No plan to come down. He found the tallest spruce on the ridge. The trunk was straight. The branches were evenly spaced like rungs on a frozen ladder. He climbed in darkness, testing each branch with his full weight before committing. The bark stripped his palms raw. The cold turned his fingers into clumsy clubs. Twice he nearly fell, once catching himself by his elbow, once wedging his boot into a crook at the last possible second. At 90 feet, he found what he'd been searching for. A natural pocket where 3 thick branches met the trunk, just wide enough to wedge his body into a stable shooting position. He tied the rope around his waist. He looped it twice around the trunk and knotted it tight. There would be no climbing down once the sun rose and the shooting started. Any movement in that tree would draw every gun in the column. He was making a choice, a permanent one. Either the Germans passed beneath him without looking up, or they killed him trying to get past. There was no third option. He waited through the night. Watched the stars wheel overhead. Watched his breath cloud and freeze on the bark in front of his face. And just as the first grey light began to touch the treetops, he heard it. Diesel engines. Low and rumbling. Growing louder. The column was exactly where he'd predicted. 12 Panzer IV tanks. 8 half-tracks loaded with infantry. 3 supply trucks. 2 command vehicles with radio antennas whipping in the cold wind. And leading the formation, standing proudly in the turret of the lead tank, a German sergeant scanning the road ahead with the casual confidence of a man who expected nothing but open highway. Vance centered the crosshairs on that sergeant's forehead. The range was 400 yards. The wind was light from the northwest. He adjusted for drop. Adjusted for drift. Exhaled slowly, emptying his lungs completely, and in the natural pause between heartbeats, he squeezed the trigger. The Springfield kicked against his shoulder. The crack of the shot rolled across the forest. 400 yards away, Sergeant Klaus Brenner stopped existing as a thinking man. What happened next was exactly what Vance had planned. The column froze. Every vehicle braked to a halt while the Germans tried to process what had just happened. Officers shouted overlapping orders. Machine gun turrets swiveled toward the tree line, searching for a target that wasn't there. They were looking at ground level. At ditches. At buildings. At everything except straight up. How long would it take you to look up? Not if you were trained to look sideways. Not if every instinct told you the enemy hides behind walls and in trenches. How long? Vance waited 3 full minutes. Let the Germans grow frustrated. Let them start to believe it was a random shot, a lone straggler who'd already fled. Then he selected his second target. An officer standing beside a command vehicle, pointing at a map and directing a squad of infantry toward the tree line. The second shot was as clean as the first. The officer dropped. The map fluttered to the ground beside him. And the column erupted into chaos again. This was what military psychologists would later call sniper paralysis. It wasn't about the body count. 2 dead men in a formation of 800 was statistically meaningless. It was about uncertainty. The Germans didn't know where the shots were coming from. Didn't know how many enemies they faced. Didn't know whether moving forward would expose them or staying still would make them easier targets. So they did both. They stayed still. And they became easier targets. Over the next hour, Vance fired 17 rounds. He killed 8 men. Wounded 3 others. He selected his targets like a surgeon, officers first to disable command, radio operators second to sever communication, machine gunners third to suppress return fire. He was dismantling the column's nervous system 1 bullet at a time. By 8 a.m., the German commander made his first major mistake. He ordered a Panzer IV to fire directly into the tree line. The tank gunner selected a likely cluster of pines and put a 75mm high explosive shell into the center mass. Wood splinters and frozen snow exploded in all directions. The blast was deafening. When the smoke cleared, there was a crater where 3 trees had stood. Vance was not in those trees. He was 200 yards to the right, still strapped to his spruce, still scanning through his scope. But the muzzle flash of the tank gun gave him a gift. It illuminated the commander standing in the turret, directing fire with hand signals. Vance put a bullet through his temple before the echoes of the tank round had faded. Now the Germans knew something was deeply wrong. They'd lost 9 men, including 3 officers. They'd expended precious ammunition. They'd been stationary for nearly 2 hours. And they were no closer to finding their tormentor than they'd been at sunrise. What do you do when an invisible enemy is killing your leaders and you can't even see where the bullets are coming from? At 9 a.m., they tried a new tactic. Infantry squads deployed into the forest, moving methodically through the trees. They were good, veteran soldiers who'd fought through France and Russia. They moved from cover to cover, communicated with hand signals, checked every building, every ditch, every fallen log. They did not check the trees above them. Doctrine said snipers used ground cover. Doctrine said elevated positions were unstable and exposed. Doctrine was about to get a lot of young German soldiers killed. Vance waited until the search squad was directly beneath his position. Then he fired straight down. The angle was nearly vertical. The bullet entered the top of a soldier's helmet and exited through his lower back. The sound came from directly above, impossible to miss, but by the time the squad looked up, Vance had already shifted behind the trunk, invisible against the dark bark. The search squad panicked. They fired blindly into the canopy. Hundreds of rounds shredded branches and bark and accomplished nothing. Vance pressed himself against the trunk and waited. Bullets cracked past his ears. One struck the branch beneath his boots, showering splinters across his face. But the trunk was thick. The position was high. And the Germans were shooting at shadows. When the firing stopped, Vance leaned around the trunk and killed 2 more soldiers before they could reload. The search was called off. The Germans retreated to their vehicles. The column had now been stationary for over 4 hours. One man with a rifle and a rope held back an armored battalion longer than some armies hold front lines. At 11 a.m., Vance heard a different engine approaching. Heavier. Deeper. When the vehicle came into view, his blood turned to ice. It was a Sturmgeschütz IV, a siege gun designed to demolish concrete bunkers and fortified pillboxes. Its main weapon was a 150mm howitzer that fired shells weighing nearly 90 pounds each. It was a building killer. A block eraser. A weapon designed to level city blocks.